Could you enlighten us about what you think your Labour Party policies would do for jobs and for a good future for young people in Sheffield?
In 2015, the Conservative Party's votes were draining into further right parties like UKIP. To reclaim some of those votes and to secure a parliamentary majority in the 2015 general election, Prime Minister David Cameron promised that, if he was voted in, we would have a referendum on whether or not we should stay in the European Union.
That is why I am in favour of having a referendum.
Partly due to the SNP sapping Labour votes, and partly due to Labour leader Ed Miliband looking a bit daft when eating a bacon sandwich, Cameron was voted in with a convincing majority. I'm not kidding about that bacon sandwich bit, by the way. If you're just joining us, you'll quickly find that British politics is pretty much indistinguishable from the plot of a Wallace and Gromit episode. For his part, Miliband stepped down, with the left-wing Jeremy Corbyn elected as the new Labour leader, presumably because you can't fuck up eating a bacon sandwich if you're a vegetarian. The following year, Cameron delivered on his promise, and on the 23rd of June, the country voted in a referendum on whether or not we should stay in the EU. Unfortunately, over the last 5 years of Tory austerity, conditions in Britain had been getting worse and worse. Around that time, the tabloids had been fermenting anti-immigrant sentiment in the people that read the tabloids, I suppose. Because of this, among other factors, and against Cameron's own advice, the UK narrowly voted to withdraw from the European Union. Having orchestrated this crisis, and despite promising that he wouldn't, Cameron abdicated his responsibility and stepped down as Tory leader. Since the vote hadn't gone his way, he decided to make way for a leader that actually believed in Brexit, which, to be fair, would have made sense, were he not replaced by Home Secretary Theresa May, who had fought against Brexit. She took the poisoned chalice, pivoting with all of the grace of an 18-wheel lorry from her position of "don't do Brexit for fuck's actual sake."
It is clearly in our national interest to remain a member of the European Union.
To Brexit means Brexit.
Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a success of it.
After 17 months of negotiations with the EU, Theresa May called a snap election to try and win more seats and strengthen her power in Parliament. Unfortunately, this was a catastrophic miscalculation, as in those 17 months, Brexit had festered and bubbled away in the cracks, dividing the public and MPs alike. The resultant party infighting meant that nobody had any idea which way to vote, so May's strong and stable leadership crumbled, and she emerged from the election with an even weaker majority. To secure that majority, the Tories had to make a deal with the Irish Democratic Unionist Party, or the DUP. May took to Parliament in January 2019, presenting her Brexit deal. Brexit was sold on the promise of a vague utopia, and so when May returned with a decidedly more realistic and down-to-earth deal, it was voted out in the worst government defeat in 95 years. The Remainers, of course, wanted to remain, and many of the Leavers wanted to leave on the utopian terms that they'd been promised. So you had some members of the Tories voting against, you had most of Labour voting against, and you had the entirety of the DUP voting against. You see, it's those kinds of negotiation skills, that ability to forge strong alliances, that we want in Brussels. May dutifully returned to the EU to continue negotiations, but she kept running into the same problems. Her revised proposition failed again in March 2019, so the deadline was extended, and it was back to the negotiating table. May then brought back a third deal, promising to resign as party leader if it was successful. It wasn't successful, and so May resigned as the party leader anyway. So began a new Tory leadership election. Two candidates separated themselves from the pack. These were former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson, former Mayor of London and Secretary of State. Johnson has always been a bit of a wild card, and true to form, he performed stunts like waving a kipper around in the air to make a point. The point itself was complete nonsense, but more on that later. Now, you would expect in a sensible world for Hunt to be the clear winner, and so of course Boris Johnson won with 66% of the votes, over 50% more than Hunt. Brexit, with its spooky new deadline of the 31st of October, was now in the hands of Johnson and his new blood. He promised time and again that he would deliver Brexit on the 31st. He completely ruled out any possibility of a delay. He was going to get it done. That was going to be it for Brexit, and we could all move on with our lives, and you see where this is going. His timetable for the ratification of the deal was also rejected. In response, he called another snap election to try and increase his majority, presumably because that worked out so well for May. And so here we are, yet another general election, the third in 4 years, and right before Christmas as well. It's going to make family get-togethers fun, eh? But what do we do? Who do we vote for? And most importantly, who's going to win? Well, if you'll indulge me, I'd quite like to sort of intensely worry about those questions for around about an hour without actually reaching any kind of concrete conclusion in this very public stress relief / meltdown that I like to call Neon General Evangelection 20.19. Brexit does not mean Brexit.
残酷な天使の手で窓辺からやがて飛び立つほとばしる熱いパトスで思い出を裏切るならこの空を抱いて輝く少年よ神話になれ
Part 1. Labour and their policies. If the tenor of my intro didn't already give it away, the party that I would like to support is Labour. I thought it better to just rip that plaster off rather than maintain any false guise of impartiality. But why do I support them? While I would really love to spend the next half an hour just making jokes at the expense of the parties I don't like, I think it's important to establish why I genuinely believe Labour to be the best choice for this country. Let's start with a climate emergency, which is what we've escalated to now. That's encouraging. Now, the climate emergency is something of a contentious topic, partly because we don't want to feel like our lifestyles are directly contributing to a huge global problem. I mean, I know I'm not a bad person, I live conscientiously, and now you're telling me that I'm somehow contributing to this huge global catastrophe? Well, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that it's not your fault as individuals. It's a systemic issue that has been building from long before any of us were even born. The bad news is that, unfortunately, it is now our responsibility to deal with it. Labour has pledged to tackle the climate emergency by, quote, decarbonising our economy while increasing productivity and creating good jobs across the country. They cite 100 companies as being responsible for most of the world's carbon emissions, based on a CDP report that claimed that 71% of global carbon emissions are created by just 100 corporations. While the UK has already been reducing its carbon emissions, it's been doing so by outsourcing production and therefore jobs to other countries, particularly China. Labour's manifesto instead lays out plans to create new funding for jobs and startups that promote sustainable energy. It also lays out further plans to build new wind turbines, solar panels, and nuclear power stations. They're trying to solve two problems with a single solution, creating new jobs and addressing the climate crisis at the same time. Part of the funding for this will come from taxing oil companies' profits. And there's a nice sense of poetic justice to that, isn't there? Them helping to cover the costs of the crisis that they've profited from. Labour are also going to increase income tax for those earning above £80,000 a year, from 40% to 45%. As far as I understand it, that amounts to around £21 more a month if you're earning £85,000 a year. Now this is something that I think makes people defensive. During the BBC Question Time on November the 21st, This man confronted Labour's Richard Burgon, upset because he didn't think that making £80,000 a year put him in the top 5% of earners.
Let's just be clear. So you're suggesting you would raise income tax on those earning over £80,000. You're saying that would affect you because you earn over that sum?
Yes.
So you earn over £8,000?
Yes, and I'm not in the top 5%.
I think that is the
No,
top
I'm
5%,
not.
isn't it?
I'm not. Every doctor in this country earns more than that.
Now, he has been dunked up and down the internet for it, but I can't help but be a little sympathetic because I think his mistake speaks to the wealth gap in this country. Somebody who earns 80k a year believes that he is in the lower 50% of earners because, compared to the super rich that, in his words, don't even work, he is making a pittance. The frustration is real, but it's misinformed and misdirected. The problem is that the wealth gap in this country is so cavernous that somebody can earn £80,000 a year and not think he's doing well. Labour raising taxes for the rich should hopefully give them the funding to increase everybody's quality of life, going a short way to ameliorating this issue. Some of the most prosperous countries in the world increase taxes for the rich by even more than that. Asking for more money from a group of people literally defined by having a surplus of cash and putting that cash towards funding healthcare and social services for everyone seems like a fucking amazing trade-off to me. Well-funded social services are unquestionably worth some of us not being able to buy caviar and champagne and £995 leather trousers. Hang on a minute, that's not real. That's not fucking real. Okay, apparently that is real. I joked earlier about British politics being indistinguishable from Wallace and Gromit, and there she is, Theresa May literally wearing the wrong trousers. Of course, this is all easy for me to say. I'm not going to be affected by the tax changes. I am nowhere close to being in the top 5% of earners, but I hope to be someday. And when I am, I think I would be happy to pay a bit more for the security that well-funded social services can provide. Even if just for no other reason than I anticipate becoming destitute very soon after I become successful as I waste all my money on rare and expensive Yu-Gi-Oh cards. And I think that stabilising our social systems is a high priority at the minute. Over the last decade, the NHS has been getting worse and worse. Wait times have been getting longer, and that's when you can get an appointment at all, and there have been fewer and fewer doctors, so the ones that are there are overworked. It behooves me not to go into why quite yet, but I think it's pretty much universally agreed that this is the case. This has led some to believe that the NHS ought to be privatised, that private companies ought to buy parts of the NHS, the competition driving the costs down and raising the quality up. To which I respond, have you been on a train lately? Since being privatised, our rail service has been getting worse and worse while also getting more and more expensive. I'm not going to bother going into detail here. If you're interested in seeing more, I'll leave a link to Sean's video in the description, but suffice it to say for the minute that privatisation on paper and privatisation in reality are often two very different things. For a more infamous example, take a look at America's healthcare system. America has privatised healthcare, and it is, by all accounts, an absolute nightmare. It costs an overwhelming amount of money to even call for an ambulance, $224 to $2,204 according to the LA Times. Sick people, disabled people, the unemployed, the elderly, and more vulnerable people besides will all be more vulnerable under a privatised healthcare service, as there is the very real risk that they won't be able to pay for expensive and necessary procedures. An American healthcare system is a worst case scenario, to be fair. Countries like France use a combination of both public and insurance-based healthcare. It's a good thing we don't have to worry about any trade talks with the US then. But what's Labour's alternative? Well, it's simply to fund the NHS better. Labour pledge an extra £26 billion boost to the NHS, giving it the money and the resources that it needs to start improving. They also pledge better funding for education, better social care, a pilot of a universal basic income, meaning that everyone, even the least wealthy among us, have some security, benefits for self-employed people, which is an increasing amount of the population, inclusive ownership funds, meaning that workers now have a stake in their company in the UK, equality for minorities and LGBT plus people, and social service improvements for disabled people. And this is where I think people start to get suspicious. Like, this all sounds like a fantasy. How can they possibly afford all this? It's nonsense. It's blue sky thinking. It's actually fully costed. Now, in the interests of transparency, I have next to no idea what any of this means or how realistic it is. If I did, I probably wouldn't be making YouTube videos. But thankfully, 163 economists signed a public letter offering broad support for Labour's proposals. That's nice of them, isn't it? Saves me having to do any work. Now, I'm reasonably confident in this manifesto, and the reason for that, I think, is that it uses such specific language. Most of the issues in here are discussed in real terms, using specific figures, and without capitulation to any third party. It suggests that somebody has looked at the issues, thought them through, and then proposed bespoke solutions. Now, how effective those solutions are remains to be seen, of course, but I think that's worth paying attention to. Well, actually, I think that ought to be the bare minimum, but politics are toilet, aren't they? Part 2. Salt of the earth or scum of the earth? Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn is the source of much of the distrust in the Labour Party. And I'm not blind to his flaws, but a lot of the time, those flaws are wrapped up in the reasons that I support him. Corbyn seems to change his mind a lot, often walking back recent statements, which makes him look indecisive. He somehow managed to change his position on a second Scottish independence referendum 3 times in a single visit. First, there wouldn't be a second referendum, and then it wouldn't happen early in a Labour government, and then apparently it would be a possibility after the Scottish parliamentary elections in 2021. He's either the most indecisive man on earth, or he listened to the concerns of Scottish voters and then changed his stances accordingly. It's one of the two, certainly. I kid, but this is a perfect example of what I mean. The ability to change your mind is a quality that I would like to see in more politicians, and that's one reason I like Corbyn. But politics is, in large part, an optics game, and changing your mind is poor optics. It looks inconsistent and unprincipled, even if it's the complete opposite in reality. Corbyn also has a policy of taking the high road, another quality that I'd like to see in more politicians, perhaps taken to a fault. His greatest embarrassment in Scotland was being heckled in Glasgow. He is accosted by a man who makes a comment about him being a terrorist sympathiser, mocking surprise that he isn't wearing his, quote, Islamic Jihad scarf. Corbyn simply walks away, not even stopping to confront him about how unbelievably racist that is. It's a mature approach, perhaps, but it's also one that looks submissive, or at the very least, passive. Just as an aside, this man that the papers were championing, as it turns out, is Reverend Richard Cameron, a man with a solid track record of Islamophobia and homophobia. Here's the moment that Corbyn is brutally heckled in front of the cameras. Yeah, you go and get him, relentlessly homophobic priest. To actually address his point though, Corbyn is not a terrorist sympathiser, he is a pacifist. Take this headline from The Telegraph, for example, in which he calls the death of Osama bin Laden a tragedy. Now, that sounds awful, right? That is an unconscionable sentiment. But that has nothing to do with what Corbyn actually said and everything to do with how headlines work. The Telegraph reduced a complex and nuanced speech to its most sensational sentence to shock people into reading it. That is how papers make their money. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't bother reading the article and instead just take the headline at face value. In reality, Corbyn calling the death of bin Laden a tragedy is but a single sentence in a speech about the problems with escalation. let's be clear, bin Laden was a bastard, but there's a strong argument to be made that by killing him, we aren't solving any problems but just escalating the conflict. We retaliate, which makes them retaliate, which makes us retaliate, and all that happens is more and more innocent people get caught in the crossfire. Corbyn is lamenting that another solution wasn't found that could lead to the de-escalation of that conflict. At worst, you could accuse him of being naive, but not a terrorist sympathiser. Even then, I'm not entirely convinced that he is naive. Lib Dem leader Jo Swinson indicated that she would be ready to launch nuclear weapons as soon as a threat appeared. She said that she wouldn't fancy Corbyn as Prime Minister because he wouldn't tell his staff how to prepare for nuclear launch.
Corbyn, as Prime Minister, the first task of which a Prime Minister has to do is write instructions to commanders in our submarine fleet.
And this is the part that terrifies me, the fact that prospective world leaders don't seem to understand quite what it is that a nuclear weapon does. De-escalation is the best stance to take. If we decide to launch our nuclear weapons first, then very soon thereafter we are all going to be dead as they pick up our nukes on radar and launch theirs back. In the very unlikely circumstance that they don't, the smoke and fallout from a nuclear impact would have catastrophic effects on the whole planet anyway. Our best case scenario is mutually assured destruction. Our best case scenario is that everybody in the world suffers. Hold on a second. Has anybody read When the Wind Blows? It is a comic by Raymond Briggs about two British pensioners trying to survive a nuclear war. They trust in the British stiff upper lip attitude and the government's woefully inadequate guidelines, and then they slowly die in the most horrific way imaginable from radiation poisoning. Because that's what nukes do, and no amount of pride in your country is going to save you if anybody, anywhere in the world, launches even a single nuke. Corbyn's policy of de-escalation in favour of diplomatic solutions, like him walking away from that heckler, seems passive rather than protective. But I have no mixed feelings in this case. Nuclear weapons' very existence is humanity's final warning. No matter how great you think Britain is, if the nukes come our way, we are fucking dead. Now, just to head off a bad faith counter-argument that I know somebody is going to make, earlier I said that nuclear power was good, but now I'm saying that nuclear bombs are bad? Wow, what a hypocrite. It's almost like the problem is the bomb part, you fucking idiot. Perhaps the major reason that Corbyn is so distrusted, though, is the accusations of him enabling anti-Semitism within Labour. Now, this is an accusation that ought to be taken very seriously, even if you do support Corbyn. The claims should not be ignored. The recently revealed Jewish Labour movement's submission to the Equality and Human Rights Commission is absolutely damning. There are accusations of absolutely disgusting language that I won't repeat here, but what I will repeat is point 7.3. Jewish members have been jeered and felt the need to exclude themselves from meetings. But that image of Corbyn as an anti-Semite is difficult to reconcile with his long history of fighting against bigotry, including anti-Semitism. In 1977, he helped organise a counter-protest against the National Front. The phrase, anti-Semitism is a cancer in our society, doesn't sound like the language of an anti-Semite. A man inviting the Chakrabarti inquiry doesn't sound like the action of an anti-Semite. A man inviting the chief rabbi to talk to him about his concerns doesn't sound like the unrepentant attitude of an anti-Semite. After a rabbi was attacked in North London, Corbyn was the only party leader to reach out to Rabbi Gluck, the chairman of Shomrim. There have also been prominent Jewish voices speaking out in support of Corbyn, including David Graeber, Professor of Anthropology at the London School of Economics. BBC Panorama seems to attribute the rise in anti-Semitism in Labour to the surge in membership following Corbyn's promotion to leadership. According to the show, people further left had been joining the party, and using Corbyn's Palestinian solidarity to bury the lead of anti-Semitism in criticisms of Israel. Despite the testimonies from Jewish former Labour members though, the show was easy to dismiss. Presenter John Ware has made some fucking Islamophobic comments before, and he's also been criticised of being biased against Corbyn. I feel like the criticisms of anti-Semitism within Labour is an issue with many sides. And this is the problem: the media coverage has been entirely one-sided. That has two problematic results. The first is that it potentially misleads an audience. I think that Corbyn's track record of campaigning against racism is a major factor in both this debate and the election as a whole. The second problem is that it makes it easy to dismiss the grievances that Jewish people have with the Labour Party as a smear campaign, as inherently dishonest. And while I do think that the coverage has been largely one-sided, I also don't think that that means we get to ignore Jewish concerns. Do I believe that Corbyn is an anti-Semite? Well, no, I don't. It sounds to me like he is taking those problems seriously. But that doesn't mean that he is flawless. There is strong evidence of a real anti-Semitic problem within the Labour Party, and that should not be overlooked. Regardless, as I am neither Jewish nor a member of the Labour Party, I don't think that my thoughts on this matter should count for much. I'm not trying to have the last word in this conversation because I should not be the last word in this conversation. Before I move on, I mentioned there that the media coverage of Corbyn has been largely one-sided, and I think that warrants explanation. The media frequently misrepresents Corbyn, almost falling over themselves to try and pin down a line of criticism. If you're game for kind of a depressing laugh, check out this thread by Colin Miller on writers scrambling to find something to slam him for, even if it means contradicting themselves. Corb out. Clueless Jeremy Corbyn caught out pretending he watches Queen's Christmas speech, but he doesn't even know when it's on. Oh, what a bastard, snubbing the Queen. How can this man be fit to be Prime Minister? What are you doing instead, Corbyn, Visiting a homeless shelter? Incidentally, the Sun attacking Jeremy Corbyn for not watching the Queen's speech and instead volunteering his time at a homeless shelter on Christmas Day is the most on-brand that Britain has ever been. This is, of course, all circumstantial evidence. But a study conducted by the Media Reform Coalition found that an overwhelming amount of pieces published on Corbyn were critical. Now, there are methodological shortcomings to examine, what constitutes positive and negative, for example. But here's another report from the LSE corroborating the findings. Between the 1st of September and the 1st of November 2015, the report found a huge imbalance between positive articles and critical or even antagonistic articles regarding Corbyn. They also found that Corbyn's views were represented accurately only 11% of the time. Furthermore, Corbyn's views were entirely absent from pieces about him 52% of the time. And speaking of 52%, yeah, I know, it's a tenuous segue, but I'm on a clock here. Part 3. Brexit means Brexit means Brexit means Brexit. Labour's policy on Brexit is to go and secure a deal and then present that deal to the British public in a referendum. Critics have derided this decision, as well as their decision to remain neutral when campaigning, when surely at this point we should be welcoming the removal of ego from the equation. Both May and Johnson promised that the Tories would deliver Brexit time and time again, and yet that promise still hasn't been delivered. Again, it would be very easy to start dunking on them, but in the interests of being specific with my criticisms, I'm not going to. I described the Prime Minister position as a poisoned chalice earlier, and that's because anybody who took that position was inevitably going to fail to deliver Brexit one way or the other. When they did, they were going to take the full brunt of the blame, when I don't think anybody could deliver a satisfactory Brexit deal in such a short time frame. That said, the approach of promising Brexit and then extending the deadline when it fails is honestly exhausting. That has taken years off my life, and it has no end in sight. With Labour's plan, they organise the best Brexit deal they can in 3 months, and then they put it directly before the public for the final say. This approach has 3 advantages. First, it ensures that the will of the people is enforced without any room for ambiguity. Second, unlike the 2016 referendum, the public know precisely what it is they're voting for. And third, if it passes, the government has a clear plan of action, endorsed by the people. Of course, one of the big problems with leaving the EU is the problem with the Irish border. And I think that Corbyn is the best candidate to ensure that there is no hard border, having been heavily involved with the peace talks during the Troubles. He was also one of the signatories in a motion condemning the pub bombing before anyone starts. Corbyn's efforts were even recognised by the International Peace Bureau, and he won the Sean McBride Peace Prize for his efforts. Furthermore, the Labour manifesto also acknowledges some of the shortcomings with the EU, claiming that if we do decide to remain, they will try and deal with those issues. They also pledge to set up a scheme to benefit EU nationals in the UK and vice versa if we do leave. Again, the manifesto acknowledges these specific issues with both leaving and remaining and proposes a sensible plan of action. Now, I can see why that's a problem for a lot of people, particularly if you voted leave. If you voted leave, then this might seem like it's walking back your decision. But democracy is an ongoing process. As new situations arise and new information becomes available, we need to have the opportunity to revise our stance. I will admit, if we do have a second referendum, I will be voting to remain because I genuinely believe that Brexit is a mistake. But what I would like to say, to extend an olive branch, is that I think people are right to be frustrated about the state of this country. I just don't think Brexit is the right way to express that. On the 4th of September 2019, there was a caller into BBC Radio 1 who claimed that we should deliberately tank out of the EU on the 31st of October. Now, I can't find the actual recording, but I vividly remember his reasoning, which was that if we did so, France and Germany would be, quote, knocking down our doors, desperate to get a deal. And I'm just going to voice the questions that I had then. On what basis? What makes him say that? What evidence does he have to support that conjecture? These and more are all questions that the presenter should have been asking to avoid potentially misleading his audience, and yet he just went, yeah, alright, thanks for calling in. Now here, I know it's BBC Radio 1, it's not exactly a political station, but it's also the 3rd most popular radio station in the UK. So here it is. Tanking out of the EU isn't going to bring back this prelapsarian British utopia where we are once again the most powerful player on the world stage. Britain was never so powerful because of some inherent British quality, but circumstance. We created the biggest empire that the world has ever seen because we were in the right place at the right time. We had the best navy during the colonial era. But why did we have the best navy? Well, maybe it has something to do with the fact that we are entirely surrounded by fucking water. This meant that we were in the best possible position to colonise other countries and exploit their resources. But the colonial era is long over and we have long since stopped having the greatest navy in the world. We don't even make ships anymore. I don't think we offer enough now that would motivate other countries to desperately sign any trade deals on our terms. Britain seems to be going through this identity crisis at the minute where we just can't come to terms with the idea that we're not a superpower anymore. The Leave campaign presented the very appealing image of a free, independent Britain standing tall on the world stage, our pockets lined with that extra 350 million per week that turned out to be a lie. And appealing as that image is, I don't think it's likely to become reality. There's conflicting information depending on where you look, but the UK seems to have come out more prosperous for its association with the EU. Now the EU undoubtedly has its issues, I'm not denying that, but I think that taking our ball and going home, so to speak, is really only hurting ourselves. Because if you want the best trade deals with the EU, if you want no tariffs, if you want free movement, if you want the best negotiators that Europe has to offer, if you want that close relationship, then we've already got that. It's called being a part of the EU. Part 4. Austerity and the NHS. Because our political system definitely isn't broken, there are only two parties that really have a chance of winning. So let's have a look at the Conservative manifesto, shall we? Compared to the Labour manifesto, which identifies specific problems and offers solutions, I find the Conservative manifesto mealy-mouthed and vaguely worded. Let's compare some of the language used. When talking about social care, Labour lay out the problems. £8 billion lost since 2010, with 2.6 million carers quitting their jobs to care for family members. They then proposed their solution, the building of a national care service for England, the development of new eligibility criteria for care, and a focus on ethics. Whether or not you agree with that policy, it's specific. Someone has done some research on this. Now, let's have a wee peek at the Conservative manifesto. They tell us that improving social care is a complex challenge, but they don't explain why that is or what those challenges are. Their solution is to find a long-term solution and solve the problem. Now, to be fair, there are some specifics, but what specifics there are dissatisfy. Here's an additional funding of £1 billion per year, but additional funding to who? Or to what? The system? Again, just to dispel any false sense of impartiality, I believe that the Conservative Party have had and will continue to have a harmful effect on this country, particularly its most vulnerable peoples. One of the major policies that the Tories have been enforcing since 2010 is austerity. Designed to help the country through the financial crash, this scheme has been an unmitigated disaster. Across the past 9 years, we have seen the following: 21,000 fewer police officers, schools closing early because they are short on funds, record levels of homelessness with rough sleepers more than doubling, record levels of food bank usage, 43,000 vacant nursing positions, and the NHS being so underfunded that the Red Cross have declared a humanitarian crisis. More severely, the measures are said to have resulted in 120,000 preventable deaths between 2010 and 2017. This statistic comes from the British Medical Journal, who attributed the figure to reduced spending on healthcare and especially social care under the Tories. Now, there's some scepticism about this figure, as it assumes that trends between 2001 and 2010 would continue, but it's corroborated by an independent study by the Institute for Public Policy Research. This study stated that 130,000 deaths could have been avoided between 2012 and 2017, assuming that trends from between 1990 and 2012 continued. They implicate austerity when they recommend funding the NHS better to remedy this. There's also, of course, the UN report. In April 2019, UN Special Rapporteur Philip Alston wrote a report in which he found that despite being the 5th largest economy in the world, 1/5 of the UK's population live in poverty, with close to 40% of children predicted to be living in poverty by 2021. He attributes this disparity directly to austerity, writing, "The policies pursued since 2010 amount to retrogressive measures in clear violation of the country's human rights obligations." The government responded by dismissing this report as barely believable. Now, I don't have the time or the resources or, frankly, the brains to go and launch my own independent investigation into this. I'm basically just reading a lot of reports and then parroting them back to you here. But I did ask my good friend Michael to give you his thoughts and experiences on the NHS. Michael suffers from a chronic condition known as cystic fibrosis, a condition that inhibits the movement of chloride throughout the body, meaning that the body is unable to break down mucus correctly, which leads to a host of complications. In the interests of disclosure, I will say that Michael is a member of the Labour Party. Also, in the interests of disclosure, I've included a link to the full text of the interview below. Michael's condition means that he relies heavily on the NHS, attending a CF clinic once every 6 weeks, a diabetes clinic once every 3 months, podiatry appointments every 8 weeks, and more besides. He has experienced firsthand the changes that the NHS has gone through since the Tories came to power in 2010. In his words, quote, "I have never received care from a member of the NHS staff that I would deem anything less than their best efforts." He then goes on to say, quote, "The facilities and equipment they have to work with, however, have noticeably declined in many cases." He describes a decline in quality in medical apparatus, with disposables having a lower recommended lifespan than they used to because of this. Car parks have often been privatised, leading to a charge and also longer queue times, making it more likely that people will be late for their appointments. Most worrying though was the effect that Michael projected a private healthcare system similar to America having on him. I'll just read this segment out. Cystic fibrosis has an end stage, when lung function is too poor to keep the body going. At this stage, the only viable option is a lung transplant. In this country, you're put onto the transplant list, and if you're lucky enough, you get new lungs. In America, insurance companies have been known to refuse to cover transplant costs. In these cases, the patient has to somehow raise over $500,000 themselves, or, bluntly, die. There is a palpable concern at the minute that the NHS is being deliberately hamstrung as an excuse to sell it off later. Now, these concerns have often been dismissed as scaremongering by nobody more fervently than Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
You're going to sell our National Health Service out to the United States and Big Pharma.
This is an absolute invention. It is completely untrue. There are no circumstances whatever in which this government or any Conservative government will put the NHS on the table in any trade negotiation. Our NHS will never be for sale.
So, where are these concerns coming from then? Well, there's the fact that Jeremy Hunt, who, may I remind you, was Health Secretary, co-authored a policy book called Direct Democracy, an Agenda for a New Model Party, in which he outlines how the government should begin privatising the NHS. We should fund patients either through the tax system or by way of universal insurance to purchase healthcare from the provider of their choice. Or how about the fact that Bain Capital, known colloquially as the Job Destroyer because real life is indistinguishable from an SNL sketch, bought Plasma Resources UK in 2013. There's also, of course, Boris Johnson writing an article on the benefits of adding private involvement to the NHS. This isn't even reading between the lines. They have actively said that they want this to happen. They're just clever enough to know to do it slowly, over a long period of time so that we don't notice. In spite of Johnson's protestations, Corbyn revealed documents on November 27th showing that under Theresa May, the NHS was indeed on the table as part of trade talks with the US. Johnson was emphatic that the NHS was unavailable, and yet the documents show the UK negotiators, quote, awaiting the clearance to negotiate and exchange text to really take significant further steps, end quote, with regards to patents in pharmaceuticals and health. While Johnson continued to deny it, Conservative Communities Secretary Robert Jenrick accidentally let slip that, yeah, okay, it was on the table. Angel emoji. Shemi, you can't read out an angel emoji. This is useless.
We've learnt today a document which sets out what one might expect to be the opening position of US trade negotiators. I don't think that's any great surprise, but we couldn't have been clearer, as you say, both in our manifesto and in the statements that the Prime Minister's made, that the NHS is not for sale.
Regardless of how you feel about the privatisation of the NHS, this is the kind of very, very important information that the public needs to know about in order to make an informed decision about who they are voting for. This affects all of us. Nobody more so than Michael and other vulnerable peoples that rely on the NHS in order to stay alive. And yet, this was all kept from the public, while the Conservatives continued to insist that the exact opposite was true, that the NHS was not under any circumstances whatsoever on the table in a trade negotiation with the US. It begs the question, Part 5, how the fuck do they keep getting away with this? Because this is far from the Tories' only misconduct. During the leadership debates, Bojo activated his stand, Kipper Queen, which allowed him to spout some absolute bullshit that EU legislation was forcing a kipper smoker from the Isle of Man to pay extortionate prices to send his kippers through the post. But the EU only regulates fresh fish. Smoked fish regulations come from the UK. You know, the country that he has been in charge of as Secretary of State. Uninformed people just blaming random shit on the EU and our elected representatives believing them is pretty on brand for Brexit though. Not that the Tory leadership debates were representative. This is a pretty embarrassing mistake that appears to have had absolutely no impact on his campaign or his credibility, which is a depressing trend with Johnson. He has been sacked from both the Times and the Shadow Cabinet for dishonesty, and yet he's still somehow become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He pledges 40 new hospitals. In reality, the funding's in place to upgrade just 6. He pledges that an accident and emergency in Telford will remain open, but moments later the Health Secretary Matt Hancock said that he still planned to restructure. He said that there would be no customs checks in Ireland until leaked documents showed that there would be customs checks in Ireland. And of course, there's the big one. The Conservatives promised in their manifesto that they would hire 50,000 more nurses, which is fantastic. Except they've included in that number 19,000 nurses that would be retained. So 19,000 nurses that already exist. So not 50,000 more nurses then. Watching the Tory ministers do the maths on this one has been incredible. It is literally a 2 + 2 = 5 situation. I know, I promise that's the only one. But can you blame me for the comparison after seeing Fact Check UK? During the leaders' debate on Tuesday the 19th of November, the Conservative Party press office rebranded their Twitter account Fact Check UK. They then spent the rest of the debate tweeting about how everything Johnson said was correct and everything Corbyn said was wrong, before declaring Johnson the clear winner at the end. This stunt falls outside the jurisdiction of the Electoral Commission, which only deals with political finance rules. They issued a warning, and Twitter also issued a warning, but currently there is no way that the party could face consequences for this. There is nothing to stop the Conservatives from doing this again. So, 2 days later, they did it again. On the same day that Labour launched their actual manifesto, the Conservatives registered the domain name labourmanifesto.co.uk, using it to spread altered claims about the manifesto's contents. This sets a worrying precedent because these stunts are deliberately misleading the public. If you've been online for a while, they might not be very convincing, but masquerading as an impartial fact-checking organisation should not, under any circumstances, be a legitimate political tactic. That is literally passing off propaganda as fact. The accusation of anti-Semitism in Labour is an important topic that ought to be discussed, but equally as important is to scrutinise Boris Johnson's long track record of misogynistic, racist, Islamophobic and homophobic comments. During question time on the 21st of November, Robert Jenrick was asked about misogynistic and Islamophobic comments made by Johnson. Writing for The Telegraph, he called women wearing burqas, quote, ridiculous, unquote, and he said that they looked like, and I apologise in advance here, quote, letterboxes, end quote. The excuse given was that the comments were made a long time ago.
Well, the article that the Prime Minister wrote a long time ago.
Aye, alright, a long time ago. I know that August 2018 feels like a lifetime ago, but that was just last year, mate. And there's plenty more where that came from. Johnson has used some intensely racist language when describing black people and children. He claimed that we still ought to be colonising Africa. He described African children as, quote, AIDS-ridden choristers, end quote, and he attributed Barack Obama's removal of a statue of Winston Churchill to, quote, ancestral dislike, end quote. Writing for The Spectator in 2005 about the 7/7 terror attacks, he claimed, quote, Islam is the problem, end quote, and said that Islamophobia was a, quote, natural reaction, end quote. That is not a faux pas or a slip of the tongue. That is specific, targeted hatred. In an interview with the Business Times, former Conservative co-chair Baroness Vorsey said that Islamophobia in the party went right to the top, claiming that the party has deliberately capitalised on anti-Muslim hatred to win elections. While Islamophobic staff have been suspended, the party has resisted the undertaking of any inquiry. I think it's important to cement that the problem is not that we have been scrutinising anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. It's that we have not also been scrutinising the very real possibility of institutionalised bigotry within the Conservative Party. There are numerous accusations and there's a wealth of evidence to back them up, and yet the media hasn't ratcheted up its scrutiny to match. This is why I don't believe that the sustained criticism of Labour has, at its heart, the noble goal of eradicating racism, because if it did, I think we would be seeing a lot more scrutiny of the Conservatives as well. But let's pretend, shall we, just for a second, that this country is actually pretty bigoted. There is another reason that people should be worried about a Conservative majority, and that's because of one small bit on page 48 of their manifesto. Once we get Brexit done, Britain will take back control of its laws. As we end the supremacy of European law, we will be free to craft legislation and regulations. It goes on to say, after Brexit, we also need to look at the broader aspects of our constitution, the relationship between the government, parliament and the courts, the functioning of the royal prerogative, the role of the House of Lords. We will update the Human Rights Act and administrative law to ensure that there is a proper balance between the rights of individuals, our vital national security, and, here's the important bit, effective government. This is a frank admittance that they want to redress the balance of power in our country, and that's dangerous. For context, in September there was a bit of a row when Johnson tried to prorogue or suspend Parliament for 5 weeks at the height of the Brexit crisis. Proroguing is traditional, but not for such a long time and not during such a crisis. The Supreme Court found this to be unlawful, claiming that it prevented Parliament from carrying out its constitutional role for 5 out of the 8 weeks left until the Brexit deadline. Johnson, of course, wasn't happy about the decision, and he said this.
It's perfectly usual to have a Queen's speech, that's what we want to do. But more importantly, let's be in no doubt, there are a lot of people who want to frustrate Brexit. There are a lot of people who basically want to stop this country coming out of the EU.
Did you catch that?
But more importantly, let's be in no doubt, there are a lot of people who want to frustrate Brexit.
He slipped up there. He inadvertently gave away the objective of the extended suspension. He said that the claimants wanted to frustrate Brexit, tacitly admitting that the objective of proroguing Parliament was to rush his Brexit deal through. Johnson has proven with the prorogation that he is willing to take ruthless measures to subvert the political process and get his own way. And now his government admit in their manifesto that they want to alter the relationship between the government, Parliament and the Supreme Court, the same Supreme Court that just reined them back in? Are you starting to see the risk? This, I suspect, is the reason that the wording of this manifesto is so vague. It makes it difficult to pinpoint the actual intent of their policies or what effect those policies will have on ordinary people. It is possible that they may be using the heightened emotions around Brexit to push a narrative that Parliament, or possibly even the Supreme Court, are subverting the will of the people. If successful, this could allow them to gain more power, removing the checks and balances that keep our democracy fair. There is strong evidence that the Conservative Party have lied to us on a number of important issues, a huge number of times, and now they want to redress the balance of power in our country? What would make you think that they would do that with our best interests at heart? The term that is often used for this political climate, where facts are ignored in favour of repeating the same policy soundbites, is post-truth politics. But the truth still exists, people are still talking about it, and so I find the term easier to understand as post-accountability politics. It's easy for politicians to insulate themselves from the truth and disrupt any scrutiny just by maintaining the lie. We don't know what to do when they do that. In the age of instant media, it's difficult to filter good information from bad information. It's easier than ever to construct a bogus narrative now, because if you are emphatic and eye-catching, then people are going to pay more attention to that than the small print. The corrections and the fact checks won't leave an impact on as many people as the image of Boris Johnson holding up a kipper will. He looks strong, he looks convicted about these EU bureaucrats messing up our good boys' fish, and that's going to leave an impression, even if it is bollocks. There is no mechanism in place to punish or even discourage politicians from telling lies. Even if the news corrects him, he still gets the coverage, he still benefits. People already know that he's a liar, and if they don't by this point, you're not going to convince them. The truth is just simply not necessary for politicians to do their jobs nowadays. Is there a way to combat this? Well, until there is a mechanism in place to dissuade politicians from making clearly bogus claims, the best thing that we can do is to not believe their lies, to judge them on their actions rather than their words. Politicians can say anything now, so the only real metric we have left to judge them on is to look at what they have done and try and predict what they will do based on that. And judging by their track record, I predict that another Conservative government is only going to erode this country further. Every time that a Tory promises that only they can sort the country out, only they can fund our NHS, only they can balance the books and take a fifth of our population out of poverty, the only thing I can think is, well, why the hell haven't you then? You've been in power for the last 9 years. It's almost like it's not the EU that's been grinding this country down over the last decade. Even if they can get Brexit done, do you really trust them with everything else? I get it, that the modern, globalised, information-driven world is overwhelming and it's confusing and it's frightening. And it's kind of empowering to imagine that if we can just disentangle ourselves from EU bureaucracy, that the UK can reclaim control of its destiny and we can be the big player that we were always meant to be. But Britain's kind of unwarranted self-importance, our stiff upper lip, it's not going to solve the climate emergency or fund our hospitals or avert nuclear Armageddon. What Brexit amounts to is a very big temper tantrum on the world stage as we realise something that we probably ought to have realised decades ago, that we're just not that important anymore. And while the rest of the world is getting a good laugh, it's not that funny for the people that have to live here. Labour has its issues, but its manifesto has clear goals and actionable changes, and it seems to be trying to improve conditions for the people in Britain. Their leader, flawed though he is, has a long track record of consistent values, and he has been campaigning for years to effect change. Maybe that is all a lie. Maybe he has got this secret anti-British agenda, or maybe, just maybe, legitimate criticisms notwithstanding, he keeps getting smeared because he presents a genuine threat to the billionaires that run our media. This video isn't me asking you to like Jeremy Corbyn, because frankly that's irrelevant. And it's not me telling you that Labour is the uncomplicated right choice, because they're not. But they are the right choice. Not just because their policies are sensible and progressive, but also because the alternative is the fucking Conservatives. And after their policies and their behaviour over the last 9 years, I have no idea how anybody can countenance that decision. I was going to do an outro here where I ate a bacon sandwich wrong, and then it was going to freeze frame and it was going to go to a newspaper clipping of me eating the sandwich. The joke being that somehow that undermined my points. But I did it, and it just kind of ended up being more disgusting than funny. And also then the bacon went out of date before I could do a retake. So now I have no ideas for an outro.